So Noctua recently released the NH-P1 passive CPU cooler and a guide that detailed everything you would need to consider for passively cooling a PC build. We should talk about that right now, right here on Robeytech. You know, this got us thinking, what is the most powerful PC you could build using absolutely no fans at all? And would it be worth the effort? First off, why would you even want to build a passively cooled PC? Well, there are a few reasons, but all of them come down to a single, very important one: noise. Now, while most fans, GPUs, and PSUs have gotten pretty quiet in the last years, they aren't completely silent. Most PC builders opt for better cooling over quieter operation, but for some, that added noise when the system is under load can get annoying or grating over time, especially if you have more than one machine in the same room. Typically, someone would simply wear headphones or use speakers to drown out that noise, but what if it weren't possible to eliminate that completely? You ever seen those like silent rooms that are just like, when you sit in, have you ever been in a silent, like no, oh man. Oh yeah, it's like crazy, and I wanna use this PC that I'm getting ahead of myself. Sure, it may be a little over the top to decide to eliminate fans entirely from your build and miss out on the extra RGB goodness and power, but Noctua thought it was worth the effort when they released the new NH-P1, which we have ordered, by the way, so that should tell you something. Now, it isn't their first passive cooler, but it is their first for large form factor builds. And what makes this cooler interesting is that it uses natural convection with cool air flowing in through the bottom of the case, rising to the top and exchanging heat on its way up and out of the case. Now, before we start talking about parts though, let's talk about what you can expect from a passively cooled PC. Now, you'll have to be more than careful with the components you choose. Not just any combinations of parts will work effectively. And we already know, it's already hard enough to choose parts, but when you add the passively cooled part, guess what? It gets a little bit more complicated. Now, another thing is that the system will run hot. That's just kind of how it works. The passive cooler is designed so that the CPU will run at near its thermal limits. Now, for Intel CPUs, that's about 100 to 110 degrees Celsius and 90 to 95 degrees for AMD. In theory, these are within the specified parameters for the CPU manufacturers, and everything should be okay in terms of not frying your CPU. Remember guys, CPUs have a lot of protection, so should they actually get overly hot, they'll do things like just shut off to keep themselves from getting damaged. However, this does mean that some CPUs just aren't going to be compatible with the cooler based on how hot they will get under normal loads. And we're looking at you, Ryzen 7 5800X, you hot piece of trash. I'm just kidding, you're not a piece of trash, but you are really hot. Now, there are some CPUs that will work, but with the caveat of lower performance near its thermal limit or not being able to hit its boost clock. So if we were picking a build that would be completely passive, but still potentially use its boost clock slightly, then we are looking at like the Intel i7 10700T or the i9 10900T.
Ooh, T.
That's not something I've been used a whole lot when we've watched the show. Well, the T series means it's optimized for lower power consumption, and while it operates at slightly lower clock speeds, it adheres to that 35 watt TDP. The T series is typically found in smaller form factor builds, but should work just fine for this setup. In fact, according to the Noctua website, either of these should operate just fine in a truly passive cooling scenario. And if you add one of their silent fans for a semi-passive system, meaning that it's semi-passively cooled using a specialized fan which runs at just the minimal amount, then it will allow for some bit of boost clock. For Ryzen options, you're looking at their G or GE lineup of CPUs, though most of those are from older generations, although we just now have the 5600 and 5700G. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Now, going hand in hand with the CPU is the motherboard. This is an area that you can't really go cheap on, and smaller boards just aren't going to cut it. The VRMs on the board need a beefy heatsink since there will be no fans to blow on the board itself. Another consideration you have to think about is if you're planning on running a dedicated GPU. Since the cooler is quite large, you don't want to block any airflow at all for convection to occur properly. You also want to make sure that you have multiple PCIe slots on the board that can handle the speed required for a GPU, aka by 8 speed, specifically given the kind of GPUs that you can actually passively cool in this case. So for this theoretical build, we're looking at something like the Asus ROG Strix Z590-F gaming Wi-Fi board, since it has a solid VRM cooling and 2 of the 3 PCIe slots are actually at least by 8 compatible, which is more than enough for any GPU we'd be passively cooling, and no, that is not an RTX 3000 series at all. It's also got a teensy-weensy bit of RGB on the I/O shield, and we're talking back to the motherboard now, which means we're gonna get at least a, 3-5 billion% increase because of the extra lights, for sure. I mean, come on, what did you expect? This is a Robeytech build after all. Now for RAM, it doesn't really matter a ton, but you don't wanna use RAM that sits too high off the DIMM slots, especially if it's super close to the CPU socket. Noctua's website does list some precautions you would need to take with certain motherboards and clearances for this, but we should be fine with our tried and true Corsair Vengeance RAM or G.Skill Trident Z if you wanted to add the little bit of RGB. Now, to be clear, depending on the RGB that you choose, there is such thing as a lower heat dissipating LED. So even though we're using like Vengeance Pro, that is gonna add some heat to the overall convection process. So in reality, if you really wanted to do a powerful passively cooled, you may wanna kill the RGB on the RAM as well. Next up, let's discuss the PSU, which really you only have one choice, and that's the Seasonic Prime Fanless TX series of PSUs. They have a few different wattages for this lineup, but the recommendation would be with a 700 watt PSU, especially if you're gonna look at using a dedicated GPU. Now, speaking of the GPU again, if you wanna go for a truly passive system, we aren't left with a ton of options right now. The only real options are the Palette 1050 Ti Calm X and the 1650 Calm X with their passive coolers. You also have the Arctic Accelero S3 passive VGA cooler, which you can actually work all the way up with like a 1070 Ti. But just like the Calm X, good luck trying to find one. Why do you think this right now? This is a theoretical video. No one appears to have any of these in stock as of right now. And if you don't want to use the dedicated Intel graphics or the built-in APU, the best bet for the quiet GPU would probably be in like an NVIDIA Founders Edition card or the RTX 2000 series card, something that basically just adds a little bit of active cooling with low amounts of noise. And then finally, there's the case itself. Now, there are only a handful of cases that are cleared for top-end passive cooling, and most of them are either large cases like the Thermaltake View 91, open air cases like the Cougar Conquer or the Thermaltake Core series, but what we would probably recommend building in is something we've actually built in on the show, and that's the Cooler Master SL600M. What's interesting about this case is that it's already designed with a chimney stack cooling method, and if you remove the top cover, this case should be great for passive cooling. Now, one benefit is also the option to vertically mount the GPU so it doesn't block airflow for the CPU cooler. Another note from Noctua though is that a case that has all aluminum with metal side panels rather than tempered glass may be actually better for doing this passive cooling stuff. So this is a note on like the Johnsbow UMX4 that has a version with aluminum side, since that will dissipate heat much better than tempered glass. Now, another interesting note is that you should avoid cases that have sound deadening material. That's you, be quiet. And in some cases the P600S, so there's a couple there, but that's because it just insulates the case and keeps more heat trapped inside. Other components don't really make a huge impact on performance, but if you're going to use an M.2 NVMe, you want to make sure that it has a heat sink. Most of these nice high-end boards have heat sinks built right in for the M.2s. But ultimately, the real question is, should you do this? Why would you want a fanless PC? Well, with fans and systems being quieter than ever before, I mean, seriously, some of them we turn on, we don't even know they're actually on, it probably isn't really worth it to do a fully passive build considering the performance drawbacks you'd experience and how much the ambient room temperature plays into the overall system's performance. But it does present an interesting idea of building a system that doesn't require fans for super silent operation. Like that. But guess what? We're gonna build one and we're gonna test it. And it's coming, and you better be ready. Why not now? Well, because we want to do it with those new AMD R5 or R7 APUs, which have some actually good gaming performance and won't require us to use one of those impossible to find passively cooled GPUs. So we've reached out to AMD, and hopefully we can get one of these here in the lab here pretty soon so we can test out that awesome bad boy. Ooh, passively cooled gaming system. So that's it for the video. What do you think of the parts we suggested? Does this sound like a silent build that you'd actually use? Do you want to try and build a passively cooled PC? Do you want to hear the silence in your head and while you game? And are you interested in how our testing is going to go? Let us know all of that stuff in the comments below. Now, while you're down there, make sure you slap that subscribe button with that like button and ring that notification bell so you get a notification each and every time we post a video right here on YouTube. We also have a live show that's every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday where we do live builds, interact directly with you, can answer your questions, and you know what, just also have a shenanigan of a great time. Check out our awesome Discord where we have over 13,500 people who hang out, talk about PC builds. You can check all that stuff out at discord.gg/Robeytech. And then finally, check us out on all the socials. We have fun on TikTok, we show the pretty on Instagram, and heck, I just say whatever the heck comes out of my head right over there on Twitter. Anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you're looking forward to our passive build, and we look forward to seeing you on the next one.